Hi, I'm Lili. Today I would like to show you how I made this sculpture out of recycled plumbing pipe. You're gonna find plenty of those in the scrapyard. You might already have some at your place. I happen to have plenty of them because years ago I built up a dining table out of plumbing pipes and leftover floorboards. Now I no longer need the dining table, so I thought might as well reuse the top for something else, dismantle the bottom part and reuse it for a sculpture. So I'm going to show you step by step how I went from this to this. The first step is to cut all my pipes with a pipe cutter. I wanted to create different lengths from 30mm to 60mm roughly. And the pipe cutter is the best way to get the job done quickly and quite neatly in terms of the finish on the copper. So I marked up my pipe, slide the pipe cutter onto it and turn it and turn it and turn it until I've got a nice clean cut. Obviously, I had to repeat it more than 200 times. And then I wanted to modify the shape. So I used my hammer and decided to hit it 2-3 times on one side, flip it over, hit it again 2-3 times until they meet in the middle. And if I didn't have a nice fit, I apply another blow just to finish it off. So I didn't invent the wheel. It was just a very simple application to modify the shape into something that is more unusual and, in my opinion, more interesting. And once you have plenty of them together and you start assembling them, you start to see the potential in terms of the shape it creates. You have each of them have an H shape, but a multiple dozen or hundred of them can create a really nice, interesting design. So I was playing with them, trying to see by changing the direction of the shape, what else I can create with. I start to assemble them following different pattern randomly, working on spiral. And then I started to play around with this idea of a snake type of shape. And I kind of liked the overall design that I was getting out of this shape. Then I had to do a template. So I took some aluminium wire because it's so much softer and easier to shape. I need to see how far 5 meters of wire will get me, because that was the length I calculated I can cover with the 220 or something pieces of copper I've just cut. If I lay down the snake shape on 5 meters of wire, it will take the whole table, it will be enormous. But the idea to overlap it on top of each other started to be kind of interesting. I thought, okay, there's something I can do with that. Now, even though this template has one line as a test and as a mock-up, the idea was to create 2 tracks so I can weld above it, as you're going to see later. Now, in order to build the real thing, I needed to switch the wire to mild steel. It's much tougher. It's got more strength to it, and I needed that resistance for the piece to hold together. With that thickness of 3mm wide, you can still shape it by hand, even though it's quite tough. It's still feasible. Once you get thicker mild steel rod, it's get just a bit too tough to shape it by hand, but 3mm is manageable. So I start bending and shaping the whole rod, and I needed to double it to create my little track. So I've done my best to copy the shape, but it's quite tricky when it's not attached. I thought, okay, I'm going to try to do roughly what I think will be right as a double track. And then with the welding, it's going to help holding together at least one point. I took a piece of aluminium because I wanted to make sure when I weld, it will not attach to the table. I've used some weight or any kind of heavy blocks of metal I can find to hold the wire down. Before welding, I always make sure I have my respirator with the filters because the fumes are toxic. The machine I use is a TIG 180 SE. Now I welded my first point, and then I focus on cutting some little part of rod that's going to be used in between those 2 tracks to keep the same distance all the time. Considering my pipes are 22mm and I have 3mm wire on each side, it left me with a 16mm wire that was needed. So I measure it up, use a piece of metal that I clamp in position to hold it tight, and that way it was easier to cut always the same length and have plenty of those little bits that will be needed all along. I start positioning them in between those 2 wires and weld them in place. That was necessary to make sure the width will stay the same throughout the whole piece. Once I had few of them welded, it was easier to control the rest of the wire and to shape it accordingly. I wanted my overall path to go up and down, so I used some blocks of metal to make sure it stays in the air and I can weld it at the right angle. And I kept at it and it started to look like a roller coaster. More weld the better. I can start to feel some strength throughout the piece. I had to extend my initial wire, so I took my time to bend them and shape them to make sure it looks like a continuous line, weld them in place, and did the same thing for the other track as well. I made sure to add one little piece of wire in between those exact points to reinforce them. And I just kept at it, adding more bits, shaping the wire until I have the whole structure welded. And then I started playing with my copper pipes. I took the smallest one, I think the first was even 25 mil high or something like this, and then slowly, gradually build them up until the point that it meets the track that goes above it. So I need that specific height to be able to connect them together. From that point onward, I use a rod that is 100% copper. I've done some test welding some extra bits on the side to adjust the torch, and then I started welding the piece, and I was building them one side at a time, moving to the next piece because I wanted the whole copper pipe to cool down before I welded the other side. Once I have a few pieces attached, it was actually easier to flip the whole thing over and to weld it from underneath. I have a better access point, and by the time I had a piece that connects with the overlapping wire above it, I make sure to weld two pieces so that the mild steel track will hold against the copper pipes. And I just kept at it, building more up, weld them from one side, flipping over, weld it on the other side. And it started to come together very nicely. It looked a bit messy at that stage, but that's fine by me. I've also used plenty of those blocks and way of raising the piece. It was easier to access underneath if it was slightly raised from the table, and I was able to weld much more pieces in a row and then flip over to weld the other sides. I found it useful to have my pipes lined up because I was going with different heights, going up and down, and I want to make sure I have the right sequence. I especially focused on that point for the last few pipes because I wanted to make sure that they will end up with the last one that is a smaller and you have a nice gradient effect, and then carefully weld them in place. Now my whole piece is done up. I've used less than 200 pieces of copper and roughly under 4 meters of wire length. It obviously needed a good cleanup, so I started with the Scotch-Brite. That was useful for the edges and also to get in between two components. So I was able to remove quite a lot of oxide that way, but there was still lots of cleanup needed. I turned to my Dremel with the extension bits and used some abrasive wheels to get in there. That helps, but I then switched to a larger wire brush on the drill. That was helpful, but it still wasn't able to reach really in between. The thing I know works better is those tiny wire brush bits for the Dremel. Those are brilliant. You can find a bunch on Amazon, and you're gonna need a bunch because they wear off really quickly. Now those little things have wire that's gonna fly everywhere and turn into tiny needles, so they could be lethal. So you need to make sure when you use them that you're really fully protected. So I will recommend a full face mask to make sure at least all your face is protected, and as much covering, and basically hide your skin as much as possible, because otherwise you're going to pluck those little needles out of it, I can tell you that. Those little Dremel bits are good and they will get the job done and get in there when other ones aren't able to reach, but they really cover every single bit of your working area, including yourself, so you need to make sure you do it safely. So this is what it looked like by the end of it. Nice and cleaned up, at least as far as I can manage. And then I've applied 2 coats of Rust-Oleum Crystal Clear Matte to finish the piece off. And there you have it, the sculpture is finished. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I've got another trip to the scrapyard booked for this week, so I'm pretty sure you're gonna see other projects on this channel made out of those recycled pipe, because they're absolutely brilliant and I'm having fun playing with them. So until then, take good care of yourself. Bye bye.